Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for this month's installment of the Keyline webinar series, Why Isn't Alexa Listening? 5 Steps for Better Conversational UIs. So speaking us today will be Shiva, Mindy, and David, and I'll let Shiva introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Shiva Harlan. I've been working with conversational UI interfaces for the past 8 years, and I'm also a senior human factors researcher here at Keyline.
And also myself, Mindy Ng. I'm a product design expert and also a lead UX researcher and strategist here at Keyline.
And I'm David Oberman. I'm a lead UX researcher and strategist with human factors experience who's conducted a fair bit of user research and validation with a range of voice-controlled devices.
Thank you. So why are we talking about conversational UIs today? More importantly, what is a conversational UI? So CUI for short. It's basically any interface where a user interacts with a device or a service as if they were talking to another person, whether it's through text or voice, usually referred to as natural language. And it's usually used to perform tasks or simply to provide information. This can be through your personal assistants, like this Google Home here, or through customer service platforms or even chatbots. So conversational UIs can be split into 2 types, a text-driven conversational UI and a voice-driven conversational UI. And they can vary in terms of complexity from something very simple from a text-driven perspective, like your simple SMS for information, like texting to check your minutes or your data usage, or texting for your account balance, to something more complex like a chatbot virtual assistant. So these have different forms, like a social media customer service chatbot, or an online recruiting chatbot like the US Army uses, where they have virtual assistant Sergeant Star answering questions about enlistment, or promotional chatbots for sweepstakes registration. So for example, Budweiser has a Facebook campaign chatbot, and Capital One uses Eno, which is a money management SMS. You also have voice-driven conversational UIs. In its simplest form, they're interactive voice response systems, IVRS for short. They're voice recognition customer service helplines or your automated over-the-phone payment services. To your more complex voice-activated home assistants like your Google Home, like your Amazon Alexa. So those are Ask Me Anything model home assistants. They can play you a song, you can turn on and off the lights, you can order food for delivery, you can ask them to read you the weather forecast. So CUIs these days are everywhere, but honestly, they haven't always been that great. You probably remember, giving up on ordering pizza with your Alexa and just switching to your phone, or fumbling to play that song in front of everybody on your Google Home for probably the longest 5 minutes of your life, or hitting 0 or yelling for operator when you're calling for customer service, and texting your cellular provider to check your minutes, but really wishing you could probably text for more information too. And this is why we think it's really important to talk about how we can make CUIs better. I'll hand it over to David. Oh, I think David's having some audio issues, but.
Sorry about that. Yes. So it's time to build better CUIs. By 2019, the voice recognition market is going to be a $600 million plus industry. Another report from Juniper states that 55% of US households are projected to contain smart voice-activated devices by 2022. And despite all that, 59% of respondents in another report using voice-activated devices indicated that misunderstood requests was one of their biggest challenges. So building successful user interfaces means understanding the user and conducting user research at every stage, from conceptual through development and validation. So based on our experience at Keyline with voice-controlled devices and conversational interfaces, we've come up with these 5 steps to help drive improvement in the field. So starting with design thinking, understanding conversational interactions, capturing a diverse spectrum of utterances, identifying success metrics, and finally tying it all together.
Thank you, David. So I'll start with step one. So like David said, step one is starting with design thinking, knowing your usage context. So that means knowing when a conversational UI is right for you. There are certain affordances that a conversational UI has. So for example, they provide a lot of convenience for your users. They unify what would typically be interactions on several different products into a single product interface. It makes it easier for people to access very simple support services like help tips, payment information, account balance information. It's also great for integration with your existing workflows for your business. It gives you the flexibility to prompt users for more information without having actual human intervention. It's also great for replacing simple forms with discrete answers. It's also an easy branding win. It gives you the opportunity to create a personable platform for a brand expression. It also makes your product interaction more friendly and humanized. But there are certain times when CUIs just aren't appropriate. They're not the best for using for use in high-risk use cases. So it's not appropriate for emotionally charged interactions like moments of crisis, complaints, escalations, counseling. It's also not great for interactions where the cost for failure is high. So for example, surgery. Not great for bespoke services where the tasks you are trying to complete are highly custom or complex. It's also not great for tasks where visuals or infographics are critical to the user experience. It's also not great for situations where users need to memorize a lot of reference information. So for example, when you're booking a flight, you need to always be able to refer to the exact flight destination and time that you're booking for. And what's most important is that when you're creating a conversational UI, you need to expect to invest in iterative improvement, especially with conversational UIs. When you're creating a product that becomes kind of this all-encompassing product, if you don't meet the user's expectations for what this all-encompassing product is, then you will fail to have your product adopted. So when is voice specifically the right choice? In terms of voice-driven conversational UIs, they provide greater accessibility to those who have visual impairment or limited dexterity from an inclusive design perspective. It also allows you to reach audiences with lower literacy levels. From a safety and convenience perspective, it gives you access to, or hands-free access to features, and also gives you the ability to personalize these experiences, especially interactions like low-risk consultations. There are also things you should be aware of. These voice-driven conversational UIs don't really perform well in noisy environments. It's also difficult for them to accommodate diverse languages, accents, or colloquialisms. There's absolutely no support for visuals. And what's most important is that you need to make meaningful trade-offs. So only use it if it saves time and provides added convenience compared to your current workflow for users. And to be able to find what the right balance is to you need to speak to users. And that's why here at Keyline, we care most about user research and design. So great opportunities for CUIs, sometimes bad ideas. So here are a couple of examples of poor implementations of a CUI. So here you have an example of a global rollout of a financial service chatbot providing generic links to help pages or visuals. So what you should do instead is try to paste all the information in your help center directly into the messaging platform. You also want to create a personalized experience, so don't provide any generic answers. And if whatever you have in your help center cannot fit onto the messaging platform itself, then you shouldn't have this interaction driven on a chatbot. Also keeping it low risk. So for example, if you were to create an automated urgent care telephone helpline, that's probably not the best application of a CUI. Here's an example where a chatbot asks you, or automated telephone helpline asks you, what do you need help with? A user might say, I have a chronic nosebleed, what should I do? And then the virtual assistant says, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. So don't forget that CUIs work best when you have a controlled amount of open-endedness in the interaction, and that CUIs shouldn't be used in moments of crisis when the cost for failure can be high. But also great opportunities means an opportunity for brilliant ideas. So hands-free use cases are really where voice-driven CUIs really shine. So a couple of examples: if you're cooking, you can ask your home assistant to read your recipe, or if you're away from your home, you can ask them to read you an article, or if you're holding your baby, you can ask them to play a lullaby. They also provide opportunities for easy branding wins. So for example, an automated learn to invest telephone voice assistant that allows you to convert your very generic online consultations into a personalized voice-driven experience for your virtual over-the-counter brand ambassador. And I'll let David introduce our step 2.
All right. Well, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how understanding the basics of conversational interaction is crucial to building better conversational interfaces. So human conversation has a structure. People take turns. There are conversational cues, explicit and implicit, verbal ones and nonverbal ones, noises, acknowledgement, feedback that keeps things going. And understanding the role that these play in human conversation translates into mapping out and building a successful conversational interface. Ultimately, an interaction with a conversational interface should be seamless with as little special syntax as possible, but we're really not there yet. A study conducted by Stuart Reeves from the University of Nottingham with several households using Amazon Echo for several months found that between 30 and 50% of their attempts to interact with the Amazon Echo device were a failure. Kind of makes us think, should we be teaching humans how to talk to machines, or should we be teaching machines how to human speak? So what we really want to do is we want to narrow what Don Norman called the gulf of execution, and that is the difference between the intentions of the users, like what they want to do, and what the system actually allows them to do, or how well it supports those actions. And so based off of that, off of our experience, we came up with some design guidelines. So conversational interfaces should be brief but informative. They should give the user a sense of what they can do, both when they start the dialogue with the interface and as they're going through. Since if there's no option screen to read, they can't tell what they can do unless they are being told. Guiding the user tactfully, having a range of ways that it can interpret words and phrases for a given command, because people like saying the same thing in a whole bunch of different ways. And respecting the context and empathizing with the user. If this is something that's going to be potentially delivering bad news, like your credit card has been frozen because of a security alert, you probably don't want that to be delivered in a chipper, happy voice. Finally, using earcon, basically audio signals, unnatural ones, to indicate state and progress. Sometimes you have to know when not to be natural, letting the user know the machine is thinking, it's processing, it's waiting. Encouraging engagement with varied responses from it. And most importantly, repair. When things go wrong, don't just dump the user out with, well, I don't understand, try again. Find ways to interpret what they might mean, offer them options, find ways to self-correct, and if all else fails, make a graceful exit. So last, just briefly touch on personas. Giving a conversational interface a persona helps humanize it. There are a whole bunch of different ways this can be done. Name, gender, voice tone, mannerisms. I mean, connected with the device that it's embodied in. You're going to want to have a very different voice connected, say, with a spaceship. As one of our examples here, Hal from 2001 versus, say, Samantha, the voice of the operating system in the movie Her. Using those can create a very powerful representation of your brand, and that can drive continued engagement. So now I'm going to hand it over to Shiva to discuss dialogue development and conversation.
Thank you. So Thanks, Mindy and David, for sharing a great overview of all the different design guidelines. The interesting thing about CUI development is even after following all of these design guidelines, you cannot build a smart and robust CUI without actually involving the user. And one of the important ways in which we involve them is to capture a diverse spectrum of utterances. And what do utterances mean? So let's actually look at the pipeline of information flow when a CUI is being used. Well, it basically starts with the user and a thought that he has in his mind. So as an example, he wants to check his credit card balance before he makes a big expense. That translates into basically an intent, which is the whatever the user wants to accomplish. So simply put, it's find out balance on ABC Visa credit card account. Look how we dropped out some of the unnecessary information, like it's because he wants to make a big expense, because in this particular transaction he's only interested in finding out the balance. So after he has that, it's still kind of like the intent is in the user's mental model. So whatever the user actually says to communicate the intent to the CUI enabled system is what we call an utterance. So an example is, what is the current balance on my ABC Visa credit card? Now, as soon as he actually says that, the system kind of interprets that on the system side and then provides a response to that particular utterance to the user. It would be great if all of the users actually used the same kind of utterance to communicate the similar intents. But as a lot of research and feedback has shown, there's actually several different ways that the user can actually say the very same thing to communicate their intent. So some quick examples are, they could phrase it as a question versus a command. So instead of saying what is the, they could say find out or get me. There's also nomenclature issues, just referring to the same thing with like different terms. There's things within syntax, just the different kind of variations that come along with the syntax and semantics of the language. And they could also break up the statement or the utterance that they're making into multiple statements, accounting for or actually leading up to the necessity for context and understanding pronouns. If it's a voice-based UI, you also have accents and volume and tone. So given that there's so many variations, what's the best way to capture all these variations so that we can build a robust database for interpretation for the CUI system? The answer is basically capturing them from the user. So to kind of summarize our approach towards it and what we recommend here at Keyline, I would say in the development stage, for each and every user intent, we would like for you to test with multiple diverse users so that they can help you capture the diverse spectrum of utterances, or basically the different ways in which a user could communicate the same intent. So there are several different methods in which they could, we could use to capture the utterances. We can deploy task completion exercises where you basically cycle through each and every utterance, and then you ask users to communicate that particular intent through utterances, and then you capture or record all the different ways in which they are communicating that particular intent. Now, we should understand that capturing utterances is actually a project with diminishing returns. It might be super easy to capture the initial 70% of utterances that people use, that are commonly used, but it's also important for a robust UI to be able to capture the remaining 30%. That's when you can actually go the crowdsourcing route, and you can actually use the creative the collective creativity of the crowd to come up with like other ways in which people might actually communicate the same intent. And then finally, it's also important to test in the field. So when you deploy to new markets or with other populations, you can make sure that you test in the field so that you understand how that particular population or that particular domain actually communicates that intent. So a quick example of a case study that Keyline Interactive completed with the Fortune 100 client. We specifically looked at how we can go about systematically capturing these utterances from the users themselves. So we recruited a diverse set of users and we conducted the study over 5 weeks. We had more than 200 participants, and through the 5-week duration, we actually collected more than 2,000 different recordings. And this kind of translated into an actual database of utterances that helped improve the robustness and the efficacy of the CUI system. And as you can see, we made sure that our user population was pretty diverse, both in terms of geographic location, but also in terms of their age group, which was important for this particular project. So now that we've seen step 3, step 4 is to kind of look at how can we identify the metrics for success, and kind of also understand when our CUI is ready for deployment or launch with our end users. So again, let's look at this through an example. In this particular case, our user wants to travel to Seattle to attend his or her brother's wedding. And the intent that it translates to is basically to book a flight from New York to Seattle on a particular date on a preferred airline. And when the user actually phrases it using an utterance, there are different kinds of responses that can come from the system after interpreting that particular utterance. And let's take a quick look at what are these types of responses to understand how we can define the metrics for success. So here are some examples of typical responses from the system. So a typical successful response would be the system coming back and saying that it's booked a flight, gives us all of the details, and has kind of taken into account all the information that was provided to it. An even better response, which is also a successful response, would be if the system comes back and tells me that there are two options, one at 7 p.m., another at 4 p.m., and asks me which one do I prefer to book. On the other end of the spectrum, a typical example of a failure would be when the system just fails silently and doesn't know what else to do, or it fails but does not give me enough context for me to be able to do follow up and fix the issue. Also, incorrect execution is a particularly stressful stress point for users. So in this particular example, if they booked on the wrong airline, even though the user specified a particular preference, and also, like for example, if the user forgot to specify some information, but the system just assumed a particular parameter and then went ahead and booked the flight out of JFK, even though the information was not relayed from the user, that's also considered an incorrect execution and a stress point for the user. And then finally, systems, it's been shown time and again that systems that have error reconciliation, basically asking the user back for more information when the user hasn't provided information, has been shown to be better received by users overall. So again, like how to test your CUI. One of the most primary metrics to understand the robustness and the smartness of the CUI and understanding when is a good time to actually launch it and get users to use it is basically looking at the percentage of intents that were accurately responded to or executed by the conversational user interface. It's important to understand what is the acceptable error tolerance, or what is the sweet spot where there are enough percentage of intents that are accurately responded to that we think that our CUI is ready. This number can be very different for different domains, and it's important to actually test with the users to see what is an acceptable error tolerance. We also want to definitely capture what's the level of engagement and satisfaction that users have in dealing with the CUI. But it's also important to understand that CUI is a system that continuously evolves. So even after you deploy it or launch it, you should still have the appropriate mechanisms to include more utterances or more features so that you can constantly improve and personalize the experience for the user. Again, another example of a case study that Keylime Interactive completed with the client, where we specifically looked at evaluating a voice-based CUI, voice-based CUI for a particular product the client had. And the specific metrics that we focused on was the accuracy of the CUI, the responses, what percentage were accurately responded to. We also looked at what are the measures that the user took for self-correction when they were met with errors, and also user satisfaction and acceptability. So we recruited 29 participants, and they tried 304 different voice commands to test out the interface. But what's more important is we actually rented out a suite, and we set up a home-like environment so that users can test it in that kind of like in the field testing, so that this is not just a lab testing, and we can kind of use the results from this testing to kind of launch the product. So we had a diverse set of users who tried it out, and the most important thing that we noticed was 62% of the commands were a success on just the first try. A further 24% succeeded after a couple of attempts, and then finally there were 15% that failed, either because the system did not know how to respond to it, or there was an incorrect interpretation of the utterance from the user. Despite that, despite having a 15% failure, the overall satisfaction with the device was pretty high. So was the reported likelihood of use, which kind of led us to the confidence that the product was closer to launch, and also gave us very specific points where we could focus on to kind of improve the readiness of the system. So that kind of brings us to the end of step number 4, where we try to evaluate the readiness or the success of our CUI, and which brings us to 5th step. So Mindy, what is the 5th step?
Well, if you're interested in building better conversational UIs, the 5th step is to reach out to us at Keyline. So whether it's to explore problem areas in your current product's conversational UI, or if you're looking to explore opportunities to build CUIs into your current business model, reach out to us. So before we wrap up, we're going to open up to questions. So feel free to type into the chat any questions you have for us, and we'll leave a few minutes here to answer your questions. So we have one question here from Eugene Santiago. If we have more detailed questions, who can we contact? So you should have received an email for this webinar. You can just reply directly to that email with any questions that you might have, and we'll definitely address those.
So that's a great question. There is no optimal. Yeah, so the question is basically, is there a Goldilocks or optimal sample size when collecting utterances? It's a great question. It is very dependent on the exact domain. So typically in open-ended conversations where people can ask about pretty much everything, that sample size is going to be bigger. So for example, a personal assistant like Siri or Alexa, even if it's a skill that's developed for those, it would be a bigger number. Whereas something that's a financial chatbot, there might be very specific things that we're looking at. So the number could be actually different. But I think the most important thing to remember is we can actually make this utterance capture an iterative process. And like I mentioned before, it's something where we find diminishing returns. And we can kind of, as we go through these different iterations, we can identify whenever that diminishing returns actually reduces to a level where with successive iterations, we are not actually seeing so many new utterances come in. We kind of, that's typically a good flagging point for us to understand that we are at a good space and we have a robust, diverse database that we can start working with.
Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions right now. Again, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. And thank you for your time. We hope to see you at the next installment of the Keyline webinar series. Cheers.